Are the victims very finally able to find principles for justice and
we're just saying provide justice.
You guys started parking at 10:30, ready?
Yeah.
So we're good?
Yes.
Okay. I'm the first judge here, so I get the plug.
Is this a calendar or?
Huh?
Yeah, it's a panel.
Oh, okay.
Two other people in there, right?
Do you want to very quickly run to the restroom?
Oh, that's right.
And then such as poetry, sculptures, and films.
I think they still have 4 minutes.
Hi, can we come in?
Yeah.
This is the one that my first was yeah, most of the volunteers are against their how do you know the first I don't know. I think I remember. Actually, this is where I learned my whole about like not being able to use things about the almanac. Because the map was on the wall, and I was like, oh, there's a map. And then you're like, oh, but there was also a map in the almanac, so I didn't actually know.
Oh, here's.
Hey, Don, how do I say your last name? Pichoti, okay.
Tell me,
Anybody willing to time?
I can time.
Okay.
There should only be one more judge coming. So.
No, there are 3 judges.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, there's tests open if you guys want.
I don't want to sit in front of the judge.
Welcome to the quarterfinals at the Greenhill Classic. Representing the proposition, we have team from Southlake, Carroll. Representing the opposition, we have USA Gold. And your judges for this debate, I am Ed Williams, I am the chair. We have Piper Doyle and Don Pachotti. Okay, all right. Piper will be the timer, and we'll get started. I would like to invite the first speaker for the proposition to address this house.
When Kevin Spacey was removed from a show to condemn him for his actions of sexual assault, the victims and family were finally able to find peace. On the principles of providing justice for the victims, we are so proud to propose the following motion: that this house would not condemn, that this house would condemn contemporary art produced by publicly condemned by actors that were publicly condemned for immoral actions. We provide the following definition: consume, to purchase from those who have committed the immoral actions. This includes things such as media, poetry, sculptures, and films. Contemporary art. This includes modern art. Our model is as follows. The first is that public acquisition is built upon facts and evidence rather than slander or fake facts. The second is that we think that the status of immorality is not determined by the individual state due to the vast variability. However, it is determined by standards that are upheld on international proposals, like in the UN. For example, because the UN dictates the immoral nature of her crimes, sexual assault, or persecuting marginalized groups, this house would not condemn art from persons that have been, this house would condemn art that is from people who have done these actions such as sexual assault and hurting marginalized groups. Substantive 1. Layer 1 is the principle of justice. One of the innate harms associated with consuming the product of the immoral actor is that they are able to reap tangible benefits off of their work in 2 ways. The first is through financial gain, because when people are gifted, they can still feel the source in their actions. They can still feel comfort in the back of accountability, knowing that their quality of life will still be intact. This strictly goes against the rule of justice to ensure that the persecutor of those actions knows the gravity of their actions. The second is that when we as a society still consume art from these actors, then society unjustifiably glorifies these people. Thus, that actor would have a portion of their life that is celebrated in media, when in reality, that part of their life is filled with sexual assault or the persecution of minority groups. Not consuming their art directly takes these benefits away. Not only that, but it allows these immoral actors to face the full reality and complete enforcement of justice. Layer 2 is societal obligation. Not only on a principle level, we should never contribute to any benefits an actor for art produced on the back of their victims, but society also has an obligation to take a symbolic stance, acknowledging the true nature of the time in which the person has committed extensive crimes. Standing up for the victims falls towards those who can make a bigger impact. Recognizing the pain that these victims have, suffrage should be the most important goal in today's debate. Substantive 2, societal benefits. Layer 1 is a decrease in harmful actions. As immoral actions such as racism and sexual assault happen because a perpetrator is in a position that enables them to do so. For example, movie producers can have many instances of sexual assault because they're in positions of power with an abundant amount of wealth. Because they think that people are below them, they can continue to do these actions, and that the people below them won't stand up because they do not have the same platform or the same wealth. And because of that, not just actions of sexual assault, but also actions of racism is worsened when perpetrators are in a position of power and influence, or they're really wealthy. Not consuming art decreases the ability to perpetrate immoral actions. By allowing for us to remove these contemporary arts that these immoral actors are doing, we would be stopping their consumption and stopping their wealth and power from continuing. Not buying the art will only decrease their monetary ability. This removes them from positions of power because it will decrease their influence. For example, Harvey Weinstein was removed from his company and he lost millions of dollars. And this is because we had multiple sexual allegations arise about Harvey Weinstein, saying that he did these horrible actions to many women who joined the Me Too movement to talk about all the damage that Harvey Weinstein had done to them. And because of that, he was condemned by society and he was removed from his business and he lost millions of dollars as a result of it, causing him to lose power and position. This process is taken to the next level in the second layer of analysis, which is the acknowledgement of wrongdoings. As these immoral actors are being publicly condemned and actually facing consequences to their actions, they will be forced to address their wrongdoings, because we would be applying real-world repercussions. This forces them to address the actions they have committed instead of continuing to ignore it. This allows for the actors to finally acknowledge their wrongdoing and accept the damages that they have done, mainly on the victim. In the example of Kevin Spacey, he was forced out of House of Cards despite being the main character, when child sexual assault allegations began to arise. By removing Kevin Spacey, we were finally able to validate all the pain that the victim and their families had to go through. Whether that be when he turned on the TV and saw House of Cards playing, seeing the perpetrator who committed all of these actions upon him, allowing him to gain more position and more power because he was continually being cast in these shows, or if he was sitting on the bus and heard the people next to him talking about House of Cards, talking about how great of an actor Kevin Spacey was. This forced him and his family and his friends, everybody around him, to relive the horrible actions, the worst time of his life, when Harvey Weinstein committed these actions upon him. However, by condemning Kevin Spacey, the victim was finally acknowledged. All the claims he made were finally validated, proving that everything Harvey Weinstein did was true, and these victims can finally have peace and solace. Before I continue, there's a point, I'll take it. However, removing these actors isn't enough. By proposing this motion and not consuming these immoral actors' art, we would remove it from the past as well, so as to not justify their actions. because forcing victims to see these actors in their peak time, or even during the time when these sexual assaults or all these immoral actions occurred, is only going to cause more damage to the victim, such as in the case of Kevin Spacey, where the child who had to endure all this sexual assault had to watch Kevin Spacey on TV, had to watch him at award shows, had to watch him receive accolades after accolades, when really he had hurt so many people and no one was talking about it, but removing his art allowed it to finally happen. Because we don't support neglecting victims and their families, we are so proud to propose.
We thank the proposition for their remarks. We invite the opposition to address this house.
I'm going to begin on a crucial clarification that must be made right now before this debate continues. The status quo is currently a world in which individuals who have committed immoral actions still are able to have consumption. So when they give you the example of Kevin Spacey at the very beginning, understand that what they are arguing for is essentially saying that at no point should House of Cards ever be watched. They're not saying that he should have gotten kicked off. That's not what we're debating. They're saying that that show and everything before it, while Kevin Spacey was present, is what they have to defend, as it should not be consumable. Let that be the burden for the proposition. Now, I'm going to outline exactly what they have to prove in order to win this round, because it's not solely that perpetrators are bad and they shouldn't be producing art. It's that that art shouldn't be available for consumption. They have to draw a direct line also between the artist and their actions and the art that is actually created. But we, on side and opposition, are going to outline specifically why you can't draw that line. Next, I'm going to address some of the points that they made very early. We agree with their definition because we think that it would be unfair to say that anyone just accused would have to have this lack of consumption. So they basically say that anyone who has actually been convicted would be the ones who are not able to have that consumption. Let's take a look at how this is actually going to affect their quality of life argument in terms of the financial gain that comes with individuals who are producing art. Essentially what they're saying is that because these individuals are producing and individuals are consuming, there's a financial incentive to produce that art. We're saying if someone is in prison because they committed a crime that is considered immoral, what happens is that essentially that quality of life wouldn't be possible, one, because they're in prison, and two, because at that point, they lose the ability to take in the money from art. It doesn't matter how rich you are if you're in federal prison for sexual assault. It just doesn't matter. Next, I'm going to move on to how they talked about their symbolic stance and how it's really important that we take action. One thing that is important about a symbolic stance is that this house is an entity that would have to control for every consumer, and the consumer wouldn't have the choice to make their own stance. If we say on net, that's going to be a bad thing. Next, they say that there's a decrease in immoral actions because individuals who are wealthy are going to, after this, not be able to produce art. But what is essential to understand is that in the case of Harvey Weinstein, he was rich before individuals came out and talked about what had actually happened. They're trying to prerequisite an argument that doesn't even exist. But understand, in that scenario, only after he was convicted would he actually have those powers and privileges taken away from him. Now, we're going to move on to the substantive part of the opposition side. We'll begin on our first substantive argument about how the art isn't necessarily an extension of the artist. First, I'm going to give you an analogy of specifically why that's not true. If there is a parent and if there is a child, we're going to relate it specifically to an artist and a piece of art. So, if there's a parent that is inherently immoral and they have a child who is the complete opposite of the parent, then that means that essentially my opponents would have to justify why that child would be inherently immoral. It's not a perfect analogy, but I'm going to give an example as a supplement. For example, if Winston Churchill, who has been described as an immoral character, doodles a puppy, they have the burden to prove why that puppy is something that is not consumable. It's not solely about the art that specifically has to do with action. They have to prove specifically why any type of that art is going to be immoral. Go.
At the point where these actors can still get financial gain within prison, a sexual rapist can still gain financial gain off that doodle of a puppy.
Okay, so here's the thing. If you're in prison, you can't use any of that money to increase your quality of life. It doesn't matter. You can't redo your prison cell because you have a lot of money. Maybe you'll have it when you get out. We're still saying that's not obviously an incentive to do that. And consumers still have the ability to make their choice. I think it's very reasonable to assume that one of the reasons why Harvey Weinstein lost his position is because of this. But the difference is that his art is technically still consumable, especially considering he's not the only one that has stake in that company. There's a bunch of other individuals involved. Now, I'm going to continue with our second substantive argument about pushing public discourse. I would say that this is going to be one of the most important pragmatic parts of this debate, because we have to specifically explain why it is better to have that art available for consumption. Now, the reason that we can talk about Kevin Spacey, the reason that we can talk about Harvey Weinstein is because they are famous and because their art is consumable and good. So what's important to understand is that the reason that we're talking about that is because they are famous and the art is consumable. Our first layer is that discussion of immoral action is absolutely important, and uniquely in our world, it is more present. The idea of art isn't necessarily to agree with it. You're able to critique the art and you're able to critique the artist. But essentially, understanding the type of art that exists is what's going to make sure that our side of the house is going to be better. So essentially, if we're asking the question, why do we tell stories? Why do we create art? That is up to the individual to decide. On a principle level, it's important to understand that we create more of that discussion because the art is available for the consumption. So yes, we draw a line that is a difference between the artist and the art. But in the event that the art is indicative of ideology, consumers should still have the ability to critique that ideology that is present in that art. Essentially, the spotlight caused by those consumers and the ability of the art to be present is what's going to spur the discussion. That's why we have so many women with the Me Too movement who are happy to come out because they realize they aren't alone. But uniquely in their world, if Harvey Weinstein wasn't as famous, if his art wasn't consumed, if there wasn't that spotlight, I think it's very probable to assume, it's very possible that not all of those women would have been as comfortable because there wouldn't have been so much publicity. Now, I understand that we have to ask, what exactly is art itself and what is the role that it's going to play in this type of area? So we have to ask the question, why exactly is art made? It's made to compare and to critique. We can't just say art on net is a good thing or a bad thing. The point of art is that it's different for every person. But when you do consume that art, you have to understand that individuals make the choice about whether or not that art is going to be on net good or on net bad. Essentially, it's going to tell you about the experiences of the individuals and is going to inform specifically how those individuals in the future can decrease or increase the certain type of experiences that are going to create the bad things that they did. So essentially, in today's debate, it all boils down to both the pragmatic and the principle aspects. Now, on principle, we have the way to explain why art isn't necessarily an extension of the artist. Remember my example about Winston Churchill, in which I said his little doodle of a dog in no world is going to be indicative of his ideology. It is the burden of the proposition to prove that because Winston Churchill decides to have a type of art, it is automatically analogous to the consumer not being able to have that type of art. I'll give a different example. If President Obama decides to write a book about his life, and you can say that President Obama was immoral because of his actions in the Middle East, it's very reasonable to say that you have to draw a line between exactly what he did and what didn't. And even if you don't buy that argument, even if you say that sometimes that art is connected, which it is, you can still have the ability to push discourse because there is the added publicity. Those are all of the benefits of the opposition side. Again, so proud to oppose.
Like that. thank the opposition for those remarks and invite the second proposition speaker to address this house.
The entire argumentation that Team Opposition just brought you is contingent on one thing, and that is saying that art is completely different from the artist that produced it. But we fundamentally just don't believe this assertion, so let's go through how the art is connected with the person that actually did the art. First off, artists make money and they gain fame because of their art. Whenever Winston Churchill draws the doodle, as Team Opposition tells you, that doodle is inadvertently connected with him, and whenever people see that doodle in public, then that doodle is associated as being an extension of them. We think that the reason that people actually go out and create art in the first place is to express their views and express what they believe in. So inadvertently, whatever art is created is an extension of what the person actually believes, and it's actually a representation of what they are. But even more importantly, the main reason that art is inextricably linked to the artist is because of the connotation that it has. Whenever art is in society, it is the representation of that person in society. Whenever somebody sees House of Cards, they associate Kevin Spacey's entire work and entire position of being in society as the art and movies that he actually released. So we think that because society judges people and looks at people's status in society based on the art they receive, because art is a form of accomplishment, we think that art is something that's inextricably linked to actually being inextricably linked to the person that actually produced it. We don't think that art can perform in a vacuum where you cannot, when you only look at what it actually represents, because it's linked to the person that actually created it. So with this, we fundamentally don't agree with their principle level argumentation, where they try to argue that art should be allowed because it's only representing the art, it's not representing the person, because society views art as representing the person that actually made it, and it's a representation of the views of the person that actually made it. Which brings us on to the second point of clash in today's debate, which is going to be this idea of discourse that Team Opposition tries to push. But we think that discourse is uniquely going to be stronger in the world of Team Proposition for two reasons. The first is because whenever they're publicly condemned and people are prevented from consuming the art, it is a societal acknowledgement that this person actually committed a crime in the first place. Whenever such action happens, it's agreed upon in society and people are spread aware of the message that this person actually committed these actions in the first place. We recognize that only some amounts of artists are household names, and only some stories of sexual abuse or other bad actions actually make the public spotlight. But there are a lot more other stories that don't actually make this spotlight. But by condemning artists who do bad actions from actually publishing their art, then that shows a message to people that this person did a bad thing. Whereas in the alternative, in the world of Team Opposition, many people can still watch House of Cards or any smaller TV show made by somebody who did bad actions without actually knowing that the person who created that show did a bad action. And that's why in their world, discourse doesn't actually happen. They're simply maintaining a world where people are oblivious to the actions of the person that actually created it. There's no talk about the assaults that actually happened. But even more importantly on this point, what they completely failed to engage with in their last speech is the fact that whenever this art is allowed to be on the screen, it forces the victims of the perpetrators to actually confront the fact that their assault happened. Every single time people talk about this assault, they're forced to confront the fact that the person has gotten away with it. And because of this, we think that this is a principle level reason and a practical level reason as to how art is not only an extension of the artist, but how in society it's portrayed. And that's how we need to ban it or stop consumption of it in order to ensure that there's also justice for the victims, and also so that there's more discussion happening because you actually acknowledge the issue actually occurs in the first place. Which brings us on to the next argument, which is going to be about justice itself. We think that justice itself happens more better uniquely in the world of Team Proposition. Because the only thing that Team Opposition brings you upon this idea is they simply try to argue that whenever somebody is in prison, they're not going to be financially compensated for their actions. But the problem is that this is not only false because people, while they're in prison, they still do receive royalty as soon as they get out because prison sentences don't last forever, but it's also a failure of the role of the government in justice. The role of government in justice is ensuring that people who are the victims actually are compensated for the actions and the rights that were taken away from them. And what happens whenever this art is allowed to be in place, it doesn't actually solve because it's a representation of the assault that actually happened, and society is unable to actually provide solace to these victims, meaning that we are the side that is best going to be able to uphold this idea of justice that we think is very important and round. In the end of the day, in today's debate, we don't think that art is simply something that people can look at and critique. We think that, yes, that is one function of art, but that is assuming that art functions in a vacuum in society, and we don't think that that's actually the case. Because of the fact the way that art is represented in media and such, it serves a larger connotation, so in order for everybody to actually uphold their obligation to victims, in order for society to actually provide compensation for victims, the best way to actually do this is going to be by preventing the consumption of art in first place. But I take a point now if you have one. Okay, I'll move on. So let's move on to our third substantive argument, which is going to be upholding the rights of minorities. We think that minorities are one of the largest stakeholders in today's debate, but before I move on, I'll take a point of information.
You claim you want more people to know about the artist that committed the felony in the first place. How does that happen if no one can see the art?
Because you have to understand that whenever this art is publicly taken off the market and prevented from being consumed, that makes things such as the headlines, and people are able to know whenever they look up for that art or look up that artist that his art is banned. That is a direct acknowledgement of the fact that this person actually committed a crime. What happens on the comparative in your world is basically the artist, the people are still able to see the art, but they have no way of knowing whether or not the person that made the art actually committed a crime in the first place. Because the only instances that we know of things such as sexual assault are those such as Kevin Spacey, Harvey Weinstein. These are very top level, high level figures. But there are smaller people that also perpetrate these actions, and those are people that people don't even know committed these negative actions in the first place, meaning that they simply get away with it, and society is unable to acknowledge that something actually happened. Which brings me back to my third substantive argument about minorities. We think that uniquely minorities are going to be benefited by allowing for the condemnation of art, because one of they're the main victims of things such as immoral actions and the status quo. And we think that by actually stopping these art from by actually condemning this art and prevent it from being consumed, it sends a message that society acknowledges that these issues actually exist. Whenever people are oblivious and they keep watching movies committed by people who are racist, for example, society is acknowledging that racism is okay and that it is not a problem. But by preventing the consumption of it, you not only recognize the harms that were done to these marginalized groups in the first place, but you also send a message of solidarity to the victims that racism and other immoral actions are actually a problem that they face, and they're actually a problem that everybody in society is willing to go up there and actually stand up for. Meaning that what happens in our world by acknowledging this issue is that you're able to provide justice and set a framework of acknowledgement, which we think is the precursor to actually solving for any of the systemic harms and any of the systemic oppression that actually happens in society today. And that is why we are very proud to propose in today's debate.
I thank the speaker for those remarks. I'd like to invite the second opposition speaker to address this House.
It became clear midway through the Proposition 2 that the prop recognized that the majority of their analysis about how people were going to be held accountable coming out of the Prop 1 could be cross-applied to the opposition side of the House because both sides have a criminal justice system. So then, in the Proposition 2, it got dwindled down to whether or not there is an ambiguous and consistent link between the art and the artist. and whether or not the public viewer has the ability to critique the artist in the first place. So now that's the main question we're asking in this debate. Two things in the speech. First, I'll be going over the two main questions that summarize the debate so far. Will the artist get recognition, and what is the discourse around art? Before that, I'm presenting our third substantive argument for Team Up. But first, let's look at the kind of recognition that the artist is actually going to get. They told you first it looks like finances. Note, this is somewhat of a contradiction because in the Proposition 1, they told you they're going to hold these individuals to a very high level of the criminal justice system. So, into that point, we think these individuals are going to be within the criminal justice system, locked up in prison. But let's take the analysis that the Proposition 2 gave you and said when they come out of jail, they're going to have money anyway. Okay, we think largely this is going to be non-unique. Likely these individuals, when they eventually come out of jail, are going to be rich on either side of the house. So that we need to examine the morality of what this recognition actually looks like and acknowledge the net harms. At that extent, we think this is the minutiae of scenarios where these individuals now come out of prison. Then we think we should leave it up to the individual to decide whether or not they are going to consume this art in the first place. Recognize this is very important. This is an idea where a person can decide whether or not the artist has exceeded their level of morality and therefore chooses to consume the art in the first place. The proposition uniquely has to defend that the government gets to make this decision. At that point, we think a lot of the victim analysis falls because the victims are not going to be the individuals who decide to engage and consume this art. But second, this is really important. The proposition accountability happens in the status quo. They tell you otherwise, no, there's not going to be another mechanism for the artist to be held accountable. All of the analysis that they give you in the Proposition 1 flows over to the opposition because it's literally just summarizing the criminal justice system. We think that if these individuals are convicted, that's something that's put on the media itself. Individuals then have the choice to decide whether or not they are going to consume the art. But the majority of this debate has begun to revolve around discourse, so let's talk about that for a second. Two big mischaracterizations that the proposition had. First, we think that people are going to know if, in their scenario, an individual committed a crime, right? The very fact that they can tell you all of these individuals committed crimes in the status quo, then we can tell that this is something that becomes public knowledge without taking away all of the art that they consumed in the first place. But what's really important is then they say, well, second, we're talking about smaller artists. In this case, we don't think that anyone is going to talk about the smaller artists who committed a felony at all if their art is just taken out of an area where it can be consumed. We think the best level of discourse is when it goes out into a public area so that people can see the art, read the art, actually talk about it. Go.
In our world, we're able to access the best of both worlds because under their own analysis, not only are they going to be publicly condemned for actually being convicted, but they're also going to be condemned for being taken out, which means that the most amount of people are going to be able to know that this is actually an issue.
You literally never tell us why that's true, right? If an art can't go out into public eye at all, I don't understand why people are going to be talking about it because they don't have the ability to have the discourse about the specificities of the art because they never saw it. The problem is you make a lot of claims, you don't really give any links. But the problem also mischaracterized this point about how the discourse around art is going to be solely proposing that we should be supporting the artists. We actually think the discourse is going to happen twofold. First of all, they're going to be talking directly about the artist. This was analysis that Cassandra gave you. We think that these individuals are going to be talking about their motives. By the proposition logic, if you don't buy this argument, then individuals would look at paintings by Hitler, for example, and not at all examine the ideologies that he held. We think that this is extremely improbable, seeing as that it's a large misconception from the prop that people aren't going to examine the artist behind the painting or other piece of art in the first place. We think that that's actually a really big and important part of art. Even if you take the proposition analysis that some of the emotions of the artist are put in the artwork, we think this is actually good because it gives society the ability to critique the art and the artwork in the first place. But second, we think the discourse is going to be about the art itself. This is the case in which the art is not an extension of the artist at all. We give you the example of Bohemian Rhapsody, in which the producer had various sexual assault charges against him. However, we don't think the movie itself is an extension of him. Instead, it shows a larger picture of what it looked like to live as a man with AIDS in the 90s. We think there was a net benefit that doesn't have anything to do with the producer himself. But second, if it's not related, then there's not going to be any harm at all, meaning that you're just getting the benefit without any acknowledgement to the artist himself or herself. That would give you this third substantive argument about minorities. We don't think the answer to this is just stifling the marketplace of ideas and not having conversations about what the artist's motives were when they created that art in the first place. At the end of the day, the thing that you're going to value the most is that we actually have progressive discourse about different things that these artists committed or created in their lifetime. That's the only way that we get to a net benefit. With that, our third substantive argument is that morality is arbitrary. At the beginning of the Proposition 1, they told you that they're going to uphold themselves to the standards of the United Nations. That becomes a little bit problematic because varying from country to country, this is unlikely to be enforced. We think that to define it as a moral action, it pushes the proposition into a scenario where no one can draw the right line for what is consumed or what creates more harm. For example, we think that homosexuality is a highly immoral act in large parts of the world. That means that the proposition takes away ground for individuals who are part of the LGBTQ community to actually engage in producing art in the first place. But let's say that you don't buy this argument and you think that everything is going to perfectly be aligned with the United Nations. Fine, but even by that standard, we think that there are certain individuals who would measure up to that standard who we still think we should consume art from. Cassandra gave you the example of Barack Obama. He famously has an atrocious foreign policy in the Middle East and could actually measure up to some extent to the level that the proposition put on you. But that means any artwork, books, etc. that Barack Obama produced would not be able to be
Point of
consumed
information.
by the public eye. What is the unique harm of this? This means two things. First of all, education is denied to certain parts of the world. You don't get that same exposure to the ideas or ideologies that a certain person held. But second, uniquely, you lose the point of view of the individual who created it in the first place. We think this is really, really important because only when you get a point of view of the individual who committed a certain atrocity does that mean that you actually get the benefit of understanding the perspective behind it. At the end of the day, there are a couple of reasons that you're voting for the opposition. First of all, we are the only side of the House that creates nuanced discourse that actually gives people the ability and the knowledge to critique the artists themselves. But also, all of the harms that the proposition talked to you about holding people accountable under a criminal justice system, are fulfilled by the opposition, meaning that we have wiped away all of the harms of accountability while producing unique benefits of discourse. So proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition for those remarks and invite the proposition third speaker to address this House.
It's entirely problematic. The team opposition comes up here and only picks cherry-picked examples of certain representations of art in order to demonstrate vast analysis on how art really affects victims and how it truly portrays the perpetrators of an act. It was not enough for them to spend the last 2 minutes of their second speech using a model quibble. And then finally, it was not enough for them to compare Barack Obama to war criminals and rapists. In my speech, I'm going to be doing a couple things. First, I'm going to be addressing some framing clarifications. Second, I'm going to be addressing who is actually the actor in the motion. And then finally, delivering 3 main questions in order to weigh today's round. But first on framing, note that in my opponent's first speech, they told you they were accepting our framing and definitions, but then they flipped their stance in their second speech, talking about how you can't accept our model because it's not applicable. But even if you do buy their flipped advocacy, we would say that the UN standards for what is deemed immoral can be applied to all international standards because it would be not responsible for us to deem all immoral actions as a variation of every single individual state. That's a vast overburden for the proposition to prove. We only have to prove what is in the heart of the motion. But secondly, let's talk about who's the actual actor. my opponents have been telling you that the actor is only the government and not society. But in reality, this is a past-the-motion argument. We would say that this house represents the society that is not consuming the art that is produced by the immoral actors. There is no government-enforced policy that is preventing some type of societal change. Otherwise, they would take out their own arguments about discourse being represented in their own world. But that leads me on to the first main question that we have to ask. Which side principally upholds the justice against the perpetrators? Now, my opponents give you this long argument about how art is not linked to the artist, specifically because it's parent and child. However, we give you 3 reasons why that's not true. First, we tell you there is a financial gain when you consume art. This is something that has been woefully unresponded to. They tell you that they're going to be rich before and after they consume art, but that's not the point. The symbolic representation of providing financial capital to an actor because of something they produced during a time of vast immoral actions is something that this house cannot uphold. And in that way, that financial capital gain is something that is a symbolic representation of supporting that person during the time of those actions, and thus we would say that is not a principle that we should uphold. But the second two is something that actually wasn't responded to at all. The second one is the art is judged as a representation of an extension of that individual in society. We would tell you that the art that is created is deemed by society more as so that person in society rather than those individual beliefs of that art itself. Thus, we would say that the figment of art in society would dictate how that person is portrayed. And unfortunately, what that means is that when society glorifies and provides fame to some type of film that was created by an actor that had sexual assault allegations towards him, that means the glorification of that perpetrator is going to be exacerbated in my opponent's world. But then finally, we would tell you that the representation of art is an extension of that person's own beliefs, meaning that we would say that you're still seeing the inextricable link in the art itself because it's created by the perpetrator. But what that means in total is that when you consume art, even if you don't buy any of the analysis I just said, we would say that the financial capital, any symbolic representation of supporting an artist, specifically during a time in which they committed the immoral action, is enough to vote for the proposition. Because on a principle level, we should do no action to support any marginal or small benefit toward that person. The second question, and on the practical, which side best creates long-term benefits of society? This is where the biggest clash happens, because it comes down between discourse through art or discourse through the action. Because there's a really big problem that they tell you. They say, how will society be deemed to judge the actions of an artist if they don't see the art? And that's why we need to analyze the art and show it to society. But they miss the big issue. The art isn't the problem, it was the action that was the problem. And a concession in the second speech loses this entire argument, as they tell you that they will know what action they committed, whether they see it or not. That takes out the intrinsic benefit of having that art, because guess what? You can have as much discord around a doodle of a puppy as much as you want, but that's not going to stem from the actual issues of that perpetrator committing sexual assault on numerous victims. We would see that that happens only on discourse around the actual issue. Because in reality, even if you don't buy that analysis, we would say that act of having that art there only perpetuates the glorification and distraction away from the issues that are actually met at hand. And we would say that the idea of having a symbolic representation of not consuming any of that art is vastly more effective for society. Because as they tell you themselves, society will know what that person committed. And when they say that, they mean that society will be able to judge the reasoning behind not consuming any of that art. That selective isolation is what makes society have a discussion about the gravity of those issues that were perpetuated. And thus, we would see the most amount of long-term change in society regarding that person is going to be on the proposition. But there are 2 more stakeholders we need to take into account. The first is going to be the actual perpetrator themselves, because we would say that perpetrator never has the ability to reform or doesn't have the incentive structure to if they don't have an actual punishment from society. Because movie stars who are rich and famous can simply get out of prison and go back to the way they were living their own lives. But without that societal pressure involved past the justice system level, we would say that it provides a greater extent for reform and a greater extent for that person to actually change their irrevocable actions to protect their victims in the future. But now that we've talked about the victims in the future, we have to take into account the victims already. Because this is a stakeholder my opponents have not touched at all. The only way they try to answer this is by saying that the LGBTQ community can be jeopardized simply because of an interpretation of the model. But as we would say, that's simply out of the scope of the motion because immoral actions is not necessarily deemed by an individual state. But secondly, we would say the victims right now are going to be vastly harmed because they are often disenfranchised because of the accessibility and the wealth of their perpetrators. But before I continue, I'll take a point.
The argument that we made was even if individuals understand there is some connection between the art and the artist, they have the unique opportunity to have discourse about it. How does discourse about the art happen if the consumer never sees it?
Because if the art is isolated, if they neglect the art, there is a purpose behind that. That is in the entire speech Southlake gives you. He tells you that active neglection is enough for people to realize the reason why it happens in the first place. And thus, the reason why it happens is because the people realize the gravity of those acts that person committed. We would say discussing some doodle isn't going to be enough to reap the vast structural benefits that we would see. Merely, it's a distraction. But now let's talk about the victims which you ignore. We would say the victims themselves have to look at these movie stars on TV every single day after sexual allegations. But when you destroy the consumption of that art, those victims are going to be vastly benefited because they no longer have to see that person progressing in society even during a time when they were committing those acts. The lack of consumption means solace at some level for these victims because that's something that my opponents can never garner. We would say that state of mind is only beneficial in the proposition world where they don't have to see all of these harms being perpetuated and seeing their perpetrator living a better life. But that is why we are so proud to propose in today's meetings.
Thank you for the remarks from the proposition. We'd like to offer the opportunity for the third opposition speaker to address this House.
It's quite telling that they said our examples never illustrated and were cherry-picked, when all their examples only showed how the justice system would work in our world. It's quite telling that they responded to all of our analysis with assertions, and it's quite telling that both their principal and practical arguments solely hinge on financial gain. We win this debate. 3 questions to frame this round. First, who wins on principle? Second, on practical, and finally, is morality consistent? First question on principle. I'm not addressing this financial gain within this question because that's mostly hinge on the practical effects of if they do get the money. We say that, we argue that art isn't an extension of the artist. This had to be proved wrong by proposition because it's the only way to access any of those impacts if we show that art is separate from the artist who made them. 3 reasons why we win. First, because oftentimes art doesn't relate to the action. This clashes with the argument that they said that art represents the artist's views. Because why specifically, if a war criminal draws a flower, that flower cannot be looked at by every single person because it doesn't relate, it simply is an extension of the artist. Second, even if it doesn't relate, it doesn't mean that the person is imposing their crime and their views upon the observer. Because if someone listens to somebody who committed assault, it doesn't mean suddenly that that person is going to commit assault. You can still enjoy music and art without the perpetrator of the crime. Third and finally, let's say that there is some sort of link. If the art holistically has better positive impacts and the opportunity cost analysis by the consumer, we think that then should be consumed. For example, the founding fathers created the constitutions, but most of them engaged in the immoral practice of slavery. The reason it's still used today is because the vast majority of the document was beneficial to the rest of the public in America. This example is applicable to art because the reason why art exists is that it improves the quality of life of the people who consume them. That's why they choose to do that in the first place. We stand for consumers' right to autonomy, whether or not they would want to listen to the art, irregardless of whether or not the artist perpetrated a crime. Why is this clash important? Again, if we approve that art is not an extension, on principle, none of their impacts actually arise. Second clash in this debate on practical. There are two main points under this. The first is on dialogue. To understand who won this clash, there's two characteristics of art that we must examine. The first is that every piece of art is unique. That is to say, for example, among grocery stores, the produce is pretty similar among each kind of store. But each piece of art tells a unique and different story. Second, art is meant to be analyzed. Art isn't just meant to be appreciated, it also is critiqued and analyzed by the rest of the public. Why then do we win this clash? Because when you spread more awareness, people do know about the actions of the perpetrator's crimes. That means more people are going to engage in dialogue, you have more awareness, you're going to have more education. Opposition essentially tells you that no, it glorifies the action and people will continue to do these actions. Here's a problem with that argument. Nobody's going to listen to Michael Jackson suddenly say sexual assault is inherently good because there are intuitive logical fallacies within their argument that suddenly glorifies them. In fact, each of their examples, the reason why each person has a negative connotation is because people did consume that art and then they started discussing awareness about that action. Why is this clash important? Because you ruin the marketplace of ideas that's happening right now. You don't understand a problem until you look at all perspectives instead of a superficial discussion that's in their world. But here's your chance to prove me wrong.
Okay, so at the point on this Michael Jackson example, those sexual allegations were discussed even if his art weren't consumed, because that art only glorified his own actions and his presence in society without actually talking about the sexual allegations.
Do you know how people knew him? They consumed his art. That's to say, if nobody ever consumes your art, there's quite literally no awareness about their actions. Nobody knows what's going on. You allow for educations on public figures. Next clash on money. This financial gain made up about 80% of the case. 3 reasons why that fails. First, because you go through the criminal justice system. To quote the proposition, allegations had to be substantiated on credible evidence. So most of the time, because these countries have developed criminal justice system, they're going to be locked up in jail. So of course, you can have a lot of money, but what's that going to do for you when you're behind bars? Like yes, you can buy more sodas and snacks, but it doesn't really have information. Even if that's not the case, increased money for these superstars don't really mean a lot. It's a law of diminishing marginal utility. What's another $1 million to a multi-millionaire who already made profits before these allegations came? Third, we think it should be a person's choice. That is, even those consumers weigh the impacts of getting financial gain to the person, we think that if it offers an intrinsic benefit to the rest of the people consuming, then it is inherently good to consume it. But let's take this at the highest ground. Why do we still win if it provides financial gain and that's bad? Because if we're benefiting the rest of society through discourse, we think that weighs on every single level. Like yes, you give a little bit of money to an already rich person with this awareness. But at the point when you're benefiting the rest of the entire society by spreading education, by spreading discourse about the actions that's continuing to be taken by these superstars, we think it's far better on our side. When you weigh the cost benefits, even if they get more money, more financial benefits, and that's principally wrong, you're still benefiting the vast majority of people. Final question in this debate. Is morality consistent? Elise told you in their third substantive that morality is often subjective. That is to say, there's a clear standard of right and wrong. We didn't hear a lot of analysis to why they said why this was false. Because propositions took all the hardline examples to build their own case. But note, throughout history, morality has never been objective. There's not a clear line of what's right and wrong. Their only response at the top of the last speaker's case was, oh, we're going to use international standards and the United Nations. 2 reasons why that's false. First, because the United Nations is literally not enforceable. That is to say, every country is in the UN, but the UN never really has any enforceable power enforcing countries what to do. Rather, what this argument deals with is that by country, everyone has a different culture, whether that means a culture like a lot of hard sect conservative Christians or Muslims are against homosexuality or marriage. I'll take your point.
So when we're talking about referring to the UN guideline, which I refer to in the framework of my speech, we talk about it because the UN has clear restrictions, so that way countries like Saudi Arabia can't impose laws against gay people, and that way we can allow for the most stable form of all these immoral actions to allow for it to be concrete throughout the world.
The majority of countries in the world have some form of laws against homosexuality. Yes, UN does have some standards, but they don't have any actual enforceability. That's to say, when you're in different cultures, you may be against an artist, people not consuming artists, simply because they're divorced, simply because they're gay. But then they tell you, it wasn't the heart emotion. It kind of is, right? Because if you read emotion, it's about immoral actors. We're telling you that morality isn't always objective. You may punish the people who aren't actually immoral. What did I tell you in this speech? First, I said that on principle, art is not an extension of the artist. That blocks all their impacts. But even if that's false, I told you first why the financial cost doesn't hold up. Second, why you spread dialogue and why that outweighs anything. And finally, why morality is inconsistent. We win this debate.
I'd like to thank the opposition for their speech and invite the opposition reply speaker to this House, to address this House.
It becomes apparent when we push the proposition on the bright line of their argumentation, when we bring up actors like Obama or Bolsonaro, who have committed immoral acts, but also bring some kind of net benefit to society, especially when examining the ideologies that they hold, and the prop responds with, oh, I don't want to defend that they have contradicted their own principle. They refuse to engage with the unique benefits that we've brought. The opposition took this debate. Two things in the speech. First, acknowledging how both sides uphold accountability, and second, which side upholds discourse. Let's look at accountability. We acknowledge that on both sides of the House, we just have the criminal justice system. They told you in the first prop that that's how it's going to work. Accusations hold up to the criminal justice standards. Why do we think we actually increase accountability on the opposition? First of all, people have discourse. We talked to you about how if movies like Bohemian Rhapsody had never come out, then the producer of that movie wouldn't have got as much heat from society about what he did in the past. It was the popularity of that movie that brought those accusations and the like on that certain producer. But second, they give you a lot of analysis about small artists and never responded as to how these small artists are going to be brought into the spotlight in the first place if their art can't be consumed by anyone. We think that was, again, a unique benefit. The only argument they have left on accountability is the amount of financial gain they tell you. First of all, Miles and I both answered this in our speeches. We told you these individuals already likely have a significant amount of money. A few $1 million probably isn't going to have that big of an impact at that point. They told you that you have to prefer the symbolic representation of what this money means. Then you weigh that against the discourse that we have, the symbolic ideas of discussing ideologies and putting your own critical analysis on that. So with that, let's move to discourse. We talk about, on the opposition, uniquely the nuances of art and other purposes. I gave you two mechanisms for this. First, when people consume art, they can talk about the artist. Second, they can talk about the art itself. We think that when Miles brought up that example about the Constitution having alternative purposes, that brought up a key contradiction in the proposition case. We're not having a world in which people just look at the Constitution and never critique the authors behind it. We acknowledge that they were immoral actors, they held slaves, and we have conversations about that idea. However, we also have conversations about the nuances of the Constitution. We think that that idea has been carried down the bench. It's cross-applicable to most other art. But then we also told you that that's going to infringe on the marketplace of ideas, meaning that if people can't absorb the art in the first place, they never have the opportunity to have those nuanced conversations about it. Our last argument here was that there were different levels of morality. We told you, for example, homosexuality was something that was viewed differently from different parts of the world. We didn't say that their model, or we were going to accept their model, we just told them that their model doesn't work. Miles explained why the United Nations is currently an actor that can't keep the rest of the world accountable. We also acknowledge that the proposition doesn't realize the faults within their own model when the first proposition speaker tells us that Saudi Arabia can't do things like impose laws on gay individuals. We think that actually Saudi Arabia can and exercises that right in the status quo, but also that's going to be the exact same problem that's cross-applicable to viewing things as moral or immoral. That means that these countries just get to put their own opinion instead of actually analyzing it. But say you pull that debate a wash, and you don't actually acknowledge that different sides have different views of morality. We still think that we're getting the unique benefit from actors like Obama and Bolsonaro because we get to examine their ideologies through the different manifests that they write. That's the unique benefit. So why are you voting for the opposition? We have proved that accountability actually happens better on the opposition. So all of their analysis about how accountability only happens on the prop is right. But second, we have the unique benefit of discourse, which the proposition does not explain enough links as to why they actually get that benefit, seeing as that the art never goes into the public eye. So proud to oppose.
I invite the proposition reply speaker to address this house.
It's very unfortunate that despite the fact we're so far into this debate, Team Opposition still has this entire argument where they simply try to argue definition. Realize that in the first speech, their first speaker agreed with our definition of what is not morally acceptable. And they keep trying to push this argument about the implementation of the motion, talking about what exactly morality is and how it changes. And we don't think that that's in the heart of the motion, nor our burden to defend it, because we're not talking about how we're actually implementing this policy. And we agree that morality changes over time, things even change over time, but we don't think that acts such as the Constitution are some things that are art that are like representative of something in today's debate. So I'm going to be doing two things in today's debate. First, addressing the key overall link in both cases, and then going down the three main actors in today's debate and how this motion affects them. Let's start off with this idea about whether artists and their art are actually linked. The problem here is that Team Opposition concedes that artists and the art they make are actually linked because their entire third argument or second argument regarding discourse is basically saying that exact thing. It's saying that artists are linked to their art, so because of that there's going to be discourse about the fact whenever people see art. So they basically agree with our assertion there, where we show you that because art is representative of someone standing in society, whenever somebody sees that art, they see it as being an extension of the artist. That's the entire link for all of their arguments regarding discourse, so we think that at that point, they basically agree to that argumentation. And furthermore, we think that we shouldn't be doing, because artists are linked, because of the fact that it represents their views and they make monetary benefit, even if they make a few $1 million, that's still a significant amount of money. So because of those two reasons, we think that art and artists are inextricably linked, and that shouldn't be something that matters in today's debate. What matters are the impacts it has on the three main stakeholders. The first is going to be society, and this happens through discourse. Now, recognize that Team Opposition's entire argument regarding discussion is basically contingent on people not seeing the art in the first place. But what they fail to understand is that this motion is retroactive. We both agree that the art is only taken out once people are convicted, so we think that people are going to see the art in the first place, know about it, and then it's taken out afterwards. So we don't think that this argument makes any sense. But what we think is that by symbolically acknowledging that this person did a harm and by societally condemning that action, that is the way that you're actually going to have real discourse that's actually going to be able to solve for issues in the long run. Realize that the alternative in their world is far worse, because there are small artists, that is a fact, and for those, there's a very high risk of people not even knowing that the person who did it actually committed bad actions in the first place. So because of the fact that it's a retroactive action, we have to weigh this risk of people not actually acknowledging the harms committed by artists in society. Which brings us onto the second stakeholder, and those are going to be those that actually commit these crimes in the first place. We think that they actually have an incentive to reform in our world, because in the alternative, in the world of team opposition, basically go back to their old life where they're able to continue making films and they're not condemned. They still make revenue from films and such. So because of that, they don't have as much of an incentive to actually reform a calculus that completely changes whenever their past work is condemned and not actually viewed by the public. Which brings us on to the third and most important stakeholder in today's debate, and that is the victims. And this is a stakeholder that team opposition completely ignored in today's debate. We see that whenever this art exists in society and is consumed, the victims and the people that know the victims of crimes are forced to reconcile with the fact that this is something that happened to them. It is pushed on them whenever people talk about this TV show or such that's made by a person that personally took away their rights. And we think this is very crucial because it is the role of this House and the role of this motion to actually uphold justice and prevent such abuses from happening in the first place. And we think that the prerequisite to it actually having any other solvency in any other fields is actually acknowledging that the crime happened and providing solace to the victims before we talk about any other issues about how this action impacted society. So because of that, we are very proud to be in proposition in today's debate.
I'd like to thank the proposition for the reply, and I'd like to invite you to cross bench and shake hands. And if everyone would give us the judges a room, we will.
I really didn't put them on the table.
Once you've made a decision, we can discuss, so I can take. Is that still going?
I'm about to check.
It is, but I'm turning it off.